we're going to kind of do this a little bit in three parts. But first of all, I want to talk about, sort of just give some sort of introduction for people that won't know his work. So I've known Oleksiy for about 14 years, and initially very much as a writer, and later as a filmmaker. And his work has a sort of, while I think being very politically clear and unambiguous, has a sort of sophistication and complexity which is rare in a lot of political filmmaking. It has a sort of a sort of rigor both in its sort of methodology and in its content and its use of its materials that is really, really very hard to find nowadays. So we're going to kind of do this a little bit in three parts. The first of which is going to be a little bit of kind of context about what work he's done, what sort of stuff it is, what we think about it. We're going to talk then quite briefly about the sort of Manchester connection, which links him to, which is sort of trailed in the description of this event, but it will sort of be an interlude, I think. And then we're going to talk at the end, well, not at the end, sort of about half of it really, about Oleksiy's recent work on Russian settler colonialism and his both in the film Chornobyl 2022 and in the recent, and I don't think currently kind of out in the world, Where Russia Ends. So I think I first encountered Oleksiy's work kind of after a fashion through rather kind of through writing and through art, particularly through their connections of architecture and film, via the Visual Culture Research Center in Kyiv and what was then the sort of Ukrainian franchise of the Polish left-wing publication and website Krytyka Polityczna. But the first time I think we really got talking about film, I think would have been around 2011, and at the time I was working on a thesis myself, which had a great deal on Soviet Ukrainian cinema in the late 20s and early 30s. Films such as Vertov's Symphony of the Donbass, a sort of fascinating and also extremely disturbing film about the first five-year plan. But the first of the kind of film work that I really came across would have been in around 2013 with Incident at a Museum and Film of Kyiv, and then slightly later, People Who Came to Power. And I suppose I want to talk a little bit about those works and also about the kind of writing that you did around the same time. There was an essay published in eFlux journal in, I can't remember if it was in early 2014, I think it was, called Maidan and Beyond, and which I would just send to people constantly at the time. Like there were a lot of people, I think, as you know very well, who had views on what was happening in Ukraine that were somewhat stupid, and I think have been proven to be stupid by the events of the last 3 years. And that essay, I think in its refusal to avoid complexity and refusal to sort of avoid lots of the difficulties of this history, still had a sort of very, very clear and unambiguous kind of political position, which is a thing I always prize, being able to be complex and nuanced and still come out at the end and actually take a fucking position. So how did you come to these? How did you kind of come from writing to cinema, and why in sort of 2013, 14 did these particularly come together?
Thanks a lot for having me here. Sorry for any possible interruptions that you might experience. Thank you, John, and everyone at the factory for organizing this. So yeah, and thanks, Owen. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. As you rightly remember, we've been known each other, been in conversations for actually almost 15 years, and thanks for also reminding me about the Dziga-Vertov connection that we share. I remember your wonderful thesis that references his Symphony of Donbass, which makes me think of my own master's thesis I wrote about the same film a bit earlier. Yeah, but so much about Dziga-Vertov. So as for your question, I think, so just to give you a background, the reason I mentioned my thesis is my background is not really in filmmaking. My background is in film theory and film history, which I did at Kyiv Mohyla Academy in Kyiv. And then basically I was almost at some point on the path of becoming something like film scholar or academic here in Ukraine, which probably would be quite a doomed path, as I see now with hindsight. And my the way I started to make films myself was basically by coming to understand that writing a thesis about film montage, which I was actually going to do. So my dissertation topic was avant-garde theories of Soviet montage. At some point, something very simple occurred to me that doesn't really make any sense to start writing about film montage without first trying to put two images together, to cut two images together, or basically to try and see how it works for myself. And basically, the moment I started trying this out for myself rather than writing about that was probably the moment I was lost for academia, for better or worse. But also, of course, this is only part of the true story. So at that time, as you mentioned, I've been a part of a collective that's been kind of a hybrid initiative founded by my friends at the academy, some of us were academics and young faculty, some of us were artists, some of us were activists, and we founded the kind of a para institution at our academy called the Visual Culture Research Center, and we basically were part of this idea very much at the time that art, kind of critical art, grassroots activism, and research are basically very much interconnected, but somehow artificially segregated by the institutions of art and knowledge. So we've been trying to work on the intersections of art, knowledge, and politics. And I initially, of course, we were very much involved with film culture, film screenings, film debates. We were stemming from the film club of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, which was kind of foundational experience for a lot of us. And so when we started to be active at around 2008, 2009, my role, one of my roles in that collective was basically documentation work. So even organizing staging events in public space or participating in right to the city movements that were proliferating at that time in Kyiv. And basically what I was doing was something that was very kind of naively called video activism at that time, basically putting together simple video reports, publishing them on YouTube, and things like that. So this was still, I have to remind, the early days of YouTube, when there was still kind of this simplistic and naive idea that this platform might have been a tool for progressive politics, and it wasn't still kind of clear to many of us that this is going to become this kind of algorithmic kind of behemoth that is basically eating away people's attention and lives. Yeah, so and one kind of decisive situation that probably made me switch to documentary forms of film was the uprising of the Maidan in Kyiv, 2013, 2014, where basically I was, I would say, because of my presence there with cameras, with my camera, I found myself more initially in an observing position, which of course is never, in a situation like this, you can never actually simply be an observer. So observation of an event, of a popular uprising, actually also in a way makes you a participant, makes you complicit, so to say, especially if you are sharing the results of your observation with other people, which I did basically also in the form of short online video reports that me and my comrades at the time were imagining as a sort of counter information activism, so to say. So we tried to, with our very small and minuscule force and resources, to counter all sorts of outrageous propaganda that was at the time trying to discredit that particular popular uprising, without, of course, evading the complexities and the problematic parts. As you said rightly, I think, so without going for oversimplification, and that basically turned out to be almost an impossible task, but it kind of took me over, and since then basically I was mostly working as a documentary filmmaker.
So I want to talk a bit about the kind of the sort of the methodology and the look of some of these films, because I remember us years ago talking about Sergei Loznitsa's Maidan, and you mentioned a particular screening in which people kind of got up and sang the national anthem. And, you know, that with your films, although I think that their line was very, very clear, that they were very, very much pro-Maidan, that they were, it's hard to imagine people getting up and singing the national anthem during them. But I wanted to talk a bit about, you know, the kind of, the two films in particular that I came up, that struck me at first, of kind of Incident at a Museum, which is sort of a little bit sort of connected to it, and then much more obviously the people that came to power. What were your kind of, this is a sort of, you know, a basic question, but bear with me, you know, what were your motivations in those two, as aesthetically and politically?
Thanks for bringing this up. So I'll try to explain kind of in short what the films are about. They're quite different, but they deal with the same topic, and that is Russian imperialism very broadly, but more specifically the usage of the myth of Russian culture, and the uses of the myth of basically the Russian Empire as as a cultural tool that kind of metastasizes very much into politics. So the Incident in the Museum is basically, I think, I consider this the first film that I ever made, because before that film, I was really kind of doing, I would say, something that I qualify as video activism. So Incident in the Museum is a film that was made incidentally. The title of the film is true. So as part of our activities at Visual Culture Research Center, we were doing a research at the time about the relationship of art politics and censorship in, like, historically in modern Ukraine, starting with the 90s. And for that research, we were visiting an art museum in Kharkiv to do an interview with a very conservative museum director over there. And while conducting this interview, something strange happened. So the phone rang at the desk of the museum director, and she informed us that she has a very important guest, and that the confessor of Vladimir Putin has arrived into her museum, and she needs to kind of stop our interview and greet the guest. And we were able to film this visit by an alleged confessor of Vladimir Putin. And this is basically what's happening in the film. I think it's kind of important maybe to stress that this person who was an alleged confessor of Vladimir Putin was actually not someone he was considered for. So this whole situation very much was in reference, so to say, to a play by Mykola Gogol, the Ukrainian writer who became one of the founders of Russian literature. And the play is called The Government Inspector. Yeah, I think it's quite well known, and it's about the situation when someone is taken, some random person is taken for someone really important. So this is basically suddenly, incidentally, really, we made a short film that was a bit of a remake of The Government Inspector by Mykola Gogol. And that basically this film is available on YouTube for a very long time. And in this film, basically, we're looking at basically kind of Russian imperialist myth playing out in the space of an art museum. This was 2013, and fast forward actually 1 year, we were in the aftermath of the Maidan uprising that led to the collapse of the extremely corrupt pro-Russian government of Yanukovych, and that had resulted in a counter-revolutionary movement planted basically by Russia in the east of Ukraine after its military occupation of Ukrainian territory of Crimea. And this counter-revolutionary movement took the name of Anti-Maidan. And it's been basically it's been, and for us at the moment of the basically the collapse of Yanukovych, the victory of Maidan, so to say, for us as filmmakers, it's been really important to witness what was going on with our own eyes. So also without a plan of necessarily making a film, me and my friend and collaborator Tomasz Rafa and Lubak Norozok, we took a ride to Donetsk, which was basically at the time center of this movement, which we witnessed as something extremely small, lacking any popularity, lacking any visible support among the locals, but very openly and very strongly supported by the Russian Federation. So in this film, people who came to power, that kind of we made unexpectedly again after spending several weeks in the Donbas region, basically just before the Russian invasion in Donbas started. The Russian invasion basically that was conceived in this kind of sort of hybrid war as a sort of uprising by local pro-Russian groups, which were actually, to a very big extent, infiltrated basically by the FSB and the Russian forces. And yeah, so in a way, in that film, people who came to power, we see these myths of Russian imperialism that were playing out in the territory of the art institution in the previous film. So in that film, it's already playing out in real life. Yeah, sadly.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes, but I sort of want to go in a bit of a tangent from this because for some reason I've decided to do this chronologically, to talk a bit about sort of architecture and iconography and the role of these things in your work. Because the film that I think is sort of best known of yours by this point is Infinity According to Florian, which builds on a lot of the material in earlier films like the film of Kyiv and Facade Color Blue, and is in many ways a sort of very kind of wholehearted and sincere tribute to Florian Yuriev, who was the architect of a sort of quite avant-garde public building near the center, sort of just outside the center of Kyiv. And it sort of has a position on, I think, on the Soviet past that is again quite unusual. There is, generally a kind of nostalgia or rejection appear to be the kind of the options that one has. Kind of either everything was completely terrible at all points and every moment, or a kind of nostalgia that usually blends very, very easily into sort of Russian imperialist positions. And Florian, as a sort of avant-garde artist, as a modern architect, and as a dissident Marxist, is very much someone who doesn't fall at all into either of those positions. And so I'm kind of curious as to how you encountered Florian, why you decided to make something about his work in particular, and I guess also how it relates to something that was happening throughout the time when you were filming Infinity According to Florian, which is the so-called decommunization process that was unfolding in Ukraine at that time, which I think also is a thing that obviously connects you to Phil Collins and to the Engels statue outside home in Manchester. But it also is that decommunization, is something that has also been invoked in a very kind of interestingly contradictory way by Russian imperialists, like particularly abroad. A lot of the time, the Russian aggression in Ukraine has been justified via a sort of pseudo anti-fascism and a kind of memory of the Great Patriotic War, blah 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 blah. But also Putin himself at the start of the invasion talked about, these people want decommunization, where we're going to give them real decommunization because, Ukraine was invented by Lenin and so on and so forth. So I'm kind of curious as to the kind of connection between this kind of delving into Ukrainian history in the 60s to kind of find a figure like Florian within it, and also your kind of position with relation to that kind of program, which I think has been, I think was a fairly foolish program in lots of ways, but has led to a great deal of misunderstanding.
Yeah, wow, thanks for this set of questions. I'll try to navigate this, hopefully in one long answer, but maybe also we can split it up if you want, and feel free to interrupt me at any point. So what I'd like to start with, so I think there's a need to really kind of complicate always this picture, this kind of relation to Soviet past that, as you said, is either rejection or nostalgia. I don't have any nostalgia for the Soviet past, even though it has been a constant presence for me and constant interest in my work, basically even long before I was doing this my kind of student thesis about Zigovertov and so on. And one thing I could learn and understand about this kind of immense and still very poorly understood thing, the Soviet Union, the Soviet culture, is that it's definitely anything but one monolithic thing. Yeah. Unfortunately, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and of the so-called real existing socialism, it's been presented as one monolithic failure. But the thing is, Soviet Union has been many different things over time. Yeah, so it goes without saying that every decade in history of the Soviet Union is not just different from the previous decade, but it's also often a rejection of the previous decade, and this was happening from the 20s, 30s, and so on, and also 60s and 70s. And as someone who's been basically brought up in this kind of ghost world of post-socialism, in this kind of ruins of socialist utopia, it's been I've been very curious, yeah, about what happened and about all of these material relics of that past. And one of those relics that kind of fascinated me since I remember myself, since I was a kid, was one particular building not far from where I was born and raised in central Kyiv, and it's a building in the shape of the flying saucer, built, as I learned later, by a visionary conceptual artist and modernist architect Florian Yuriev, whom you mentioned. And later on, during my time at the Visual Culture Research Center, we did, among other things, some research about history of modernist architecture in Kyiv, and that's when I was able to meet Florian Yuriev, who was in his late 80s at the time. And meeting this person really, among many other things, helped me complicate and nuance my understanding of what happened, basically what the Soviet Union of Soviet culture was or could be. So just to try to be very short about this immense figure. So Florian Yuriev was a Marxist dissident and staunch kind of anti-Soviet Marxist dissident, yeah, who spent a lot of time in Gulag, both in his childhood and youth, and so on. But nevertheless, he was someone who was able to basically, despite his staunchly anti-Soviet Marxism dissidents, to build and to realize his kind of utopian project in architecture by being commissioned to build this avant-garde concert hall in central Kyiv that is known as the Flying Saucer Building, which basically has been built during the 60s and 70s, and since the early 90s has become one of these modernist ruins. So the Institute of Information that that was located in this building, of course, became one of the redundant institutions in the post-Soviet Ukraine, and the building fell into disrepair, which was the case up until around 2017, when we at the Visual Culture Research Center had an idea to organize an art biennial, the Kyiv Biennial, which we were running at the time, and to have the Flying Saucer as its main venue. This had strangely coincided with the deal that the government, so the Ministry of Education that owns the building, made a deal with one of the most notorious real estate developers in Kyiv, who is actually a Russian oligarch who still lives in Kyiv, called Vagiv Aliyev. And according to this deal, this modernist landmark would be basically rented out and given away to the new mega shopping mall that this guy has been trying to build just adjacent to the Flying Saucer. So I knew because I knew Florian Yuriev at the time. He was 89 years old when this happened. Despite his age and his poor health, and despite the fact that he had totally different plans for the late years of his life, Florian Yuriev became a very active participant in this sort of right to the city movement that emerged in defense of the flying saucer and in opposition to the plans of turning it into a shopping mall. And this civic movement has been called Save Kyiv Modernism. And of course, this was not just about one particular building, it was about kind of reversing this really problematic and in many ways simply foolish policies of decommunization. Yeah, I'm not sure how deeply I should go in explaining what decommunization is, because I was just really surprised a couple of weeks ago when I was giving a talk to a foreign audience, and it transpired that people really do not understand when I say decommunization. And I thought it's a good thing, yeah, that people are probably, some audiences are happy not to know what decommunization means, and I'm not sure whether this is the case, but basically I think it's a process that each of the post-socialist countries had gone through at some point, and this has been mostly about the removal of monuments, statues, and symbols of the communist past from public space. And one curious thing about decommunization in our country, but not just our country, is that it seems just to be perpetual. Yeah, so there were so many monuments and symbols devoted to communism erected during the Soviet Union that even though they've been under the process of removal since the 90s, basically our cities and spaces are still full of them. But of course, it's hard to probably explain why I think something like this flying saucer shaped cosmist architecture also, why are we discussing this in the context of decommunization? Because it is not very, this is not kind of obviously, this is obviously not necessarily a communist kind of image, yeah. But the real problem is that decommunization, as it's been evolving starting from 2015 in Ukraine, has been largely basically a smoke screen for this kind of large-scale privatization of public space, of basically public goods, public facilities. That's basically been ongoing long before the Maidan uprising. That's been kind of intensified by the governments that misused the Maidan uprising to their advantage. But so this smoke screen became really helpful in this kind of goal of, privatizing whatever was still public, and the flying saucer has, of course, been one of the important symbols.
Yeah, I mean, I
of
suppose
this process.
I think because I've miscalculated the time a little bit, we might skip over Phil Collins and the Engels statue, which of course was sort of epiphenomenon of the decommunization process, which is sort of how it ended up here, and you played a small role in sort of trying to, in a project that was sort of designed to sort of inoculate it against the accusation that in some way this statue being here, sort of in some way helped Russian propaganda or the Russian war effort, or that Engels had some responsibility for anything that's ever happened in Russia. So I want to kind of go to get to the kind of last kind of part of this that I wanted to talk about, which is the work that you've done since 2022, which obviously builds on lots of the previous work on Russian imperialism and settler colonialism. And there's an essay which you wrote in 2022, which is the second time that one of your essays in eFlux I've ended up sending to dozens of people in a kind of like, read this is really, really good. Explains this thing that's happening a lot better than all the rubbish you're reading, which was an essay called The Case Against the Russian Federation. And a lot of your work since then as a filmmaker is sort of built on quite similar themes, which I've sort of drawn on work you've done in the sort of time in between on resource networks and infrastructure, but I've kind of rooted that in an understanding which historically seems pretty impregnable, historically seems pretty obvious to me, that Russia is significantly a settler colonial state. I remember a particular meme doing the rounds on left Twitter when I was on left Twitter, that basically showed like a map of Africa during the Congress of Berlin, and showed the fact that there weren't any Russian colonies in Africa, and when it's like, look, Russia's not a colonial country. And I remember thinking, like, have you heard of this country called Asia? This continent called Asia has, if you look at a map of that, you will find the sort of strange idea that because it's a contiguous state on the map, that somehow this people kind of ended up just sort of walking over from Eastern Europe to Siberia, to like the borders of Korea, the borders of Mongolia, the borders of Iran, and just kind of went there accidentally, And obviously this is absolutely absurd, and it's a deeply, deeply settler colonial country. But I'm curious as to why this became the specific focus of lots of your work. Not all of it. I think Chornobyl 2022 is a slightly different, it's connected to it, but it's not as direct. But a lot of your recent work has returned to this question of seeing Russian imperialism in a larger context. It's one of many examples of a settler colonial country, that its imperialism and its resource extraction are understandable in that context, and similar to other capitalist empires in the 19th and 20th century. And also how that connects to a recent found footage film. Actually, we'll kind of talk about that a bit after, but just first of all, just if you could kind of talk a bit about why you decided to make that the focus of a lot of recent work.
Yeah, in a way, I don't think I had any choice, since basically Russia and Federation renewed its invasion of Ukraine in 2022 in a full-scale format, and we had all found ourselves in the midst of a colonial war, in the midst of an imperialist war that's been fought by kind of far-right government of the Russian Federation under openly imperialist and colonial pretexts, but has not been seen as such by the bigger part of the world, so to say, or some parts of the global audience that were still duped by the idea that the Russian Federation somehow cannot be an evil colonial empire because the Soviet Union had some role in decolonization of Africa and things like that. Okay, so I'll really try to not go on about this forever, because this is what I can do. So yeah, I have to say that the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist stances and positions were quite widespread in my milieu, so among the Ukrainian left, and not just left, basically in the Ukrainian public discourse for quite some time. Yeah, it's been quite clear to a lot of us here that Ukraine has been in a very complex colonial dialectic with Russia for a very long time, something that very painfully dawned on at least parts of the global public in February 22, when Russia finally kind of exposed its colonial and imperialist kind of character of its regime. And as I mentioned in the previous part of our talk, I mean, kind of my interest and analysis of Russian colonialism, of Russian imperialism, is not something new for me. I think that us in Ukraine are as kind of subjects of this colonial rule and as people or as community upon whom this imperial rule has been imprinted for quite some time. Maybe in a way, I would say we are in a bit better position towards really understanding Russian culture than, frankly, many people in Russia, and certainly and outside Russia, than many, I would say, public intellectuals from Russia who are actually people coming very much from inside of this imperial culture. I would just clarify that I'm saying that we in Ukraine are maybe positioned better to interpret and understand Russian culture than many Russian thinkers themselves, because we, due to our colonial status, we know Russian culture very well, and we all are also able to speak Russian and to read Russian and so on. But we are able to look at Russian culture both from within and from the inside, I would say, yes. So I would try to explain this position like that. I've been, just today I've been referencing the government inspector and Mykola Gogol. I repeat, the Ukrainian writer who created Russian literature. And I'm saying this without any kind of reference to national pride about, kind of Ukrainians, blah, 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 creating Russian literature. So as for the new film, like one way for me to approach and expose this topic of basically this analysis of Russia as a settler colonial, essentially white settler colonial entity that's been dominating, exterminating, and basically genociding quite a big number of non-white cultures, nations, and peoples in what we refer to as Northeast Eurasia since basically around the 16th and 17th century, quite in parallel, with this so-called age of discovery. So basically, this was a movement of white settlers, white armed settlers towards the east that's been very much parallel to the movement of white settlers towards the west by maritime means. So the peculiarity of Russian imperialism is very simple. There is no ocean and there is no sea between the metropolis and the colony, which is still very much puzzling to a lot of even decolonial scholars, who still refuse the status of colonial empire to Russia on that very basis. That somehow, if you don't sail to your colony, if you don't have to cross the ocean, then you're not really empire. And I think this view is extremely problematic because it's very Western-centric. Somehow big parts of the colonial discourse that are extremely critical, and rightly so, of Western colonialism remain extremely Western-centric because they are blind to other forms of colonialism that don't have to be always maritime. So in case of Russia, basically, you can simply walk to your colony or kind of ride to your colony, or these days drive to your colony in Siberia. And yeah, so in this new work, new film that was just completed last month, and it's a short found footage documentary called Where Russia Ends.
Yeah, so
By the way,
sorry,
yeah.
go on.
Sorry.
I wanted to talk a bit about its use of sort of a couple of questions about it, really. One of which is its use of found footage. I know because I was trying to make you write about it that you were very disparaging, and in many ways rightly so, of Adam Curtis's found footage film made using material from the BBC archives, which referred to an enormous territory, lots of which is not only not Russia, but not even the Russian Federation in its title as Russia. And Curtis is not a stupid man, so I was always baffled as to why he did that. But in the same way that uses one particular source, the film we're talking about is mainly, if I'm not wrong, it's from the Popular Science Film Studio in Kyiv, from between the 60s and 80s. Am I right, roughly about? And sort of deals mainly with sort of peoples of the sort of far northeastern Eurasia, sort of Khanty and Nenets and Sakha and Buryatia and so forth. And sort of what were these films, first of all, and what so I remember some of them are by Felix Sobolyev, who I remember you recommending I see a few years ago. And how did you come across them, and how did you decide to use those in particular?
Yeah, so the prehistory of this film is the following. So since several years now, I've been trying to retrieve and recover the legacy of the Science Film Studio in Kyiv, which is basically an abandoned film studio that back in the days was a leading kind of producer of Soviet film, of science films in the Soviet Union, and that is now basically kind of hosting an immense and really abandoned archive of several thousand film reels that were produced by the filmmakers at the studio, and as part of a general collapse of social institutions in the post-Soviet Ukraine, this enormous archive fell into basically disregard and disrepair. So in the last several years, I've been trying to work to digitize and reconceptualize parts of this archive, which includes also not just completed films made by the Science Film Studio, so it's kind of science documentaries, but also unedited rushes, raw footage, documentary raw footage that was made for the films that were either never completed or no one knows what happened to those films, but the footage that was shot for those films survived, yeah, and I was able to work and digitize this footage. And while working in this abandoned archive, I came across, surprisingly for me, I came across quite a big number of film materials and also raw footage, unedited raw footage, shot by Ukrainian filmmakers from that particular studio in Siberia, in different parts of Siberia during the 1970s, 1980s, and the beginning of 1990s. So this, in a way, is surprising, but not really, because Soviet Ukraine was very much at the forefront of industrial colonization everywhere in the Soviet Union, yeah, and the filmmakers from Ukraine basically were there as colonizers, yeah, they were there as part of this enormous extractivist project, colonial extractivist project of the so-called development of natural resources of Siberia, and film was very much part of that. But because during these trips, some of the footage that was made survived in unedited form, and I was able to work with it very closely. It kind of coincided with my interest and research into basically the mechanisms and the structures of Russian settler colonialism as they unfold not just in the territory of Ukraine, but also in the territories of other Russian colonies, such as various Siberian lands.
I mean, one of the
that
things
were
that,
subject.
yeah, I mean, one of the things that really kind of seems extremely pointed within it is, you know, lots of the kind of infrastructures you're talking about, the kind of the pipelines that would bring oil and gas from Siberia, you know, the railway infrastructure that's being built at the time, such as the kind of famous, you know, semi-failed Grand Project of the Baikal and Amur Main Line. But it's the oil and gas pipelines that I'm particularly interested in, because you point out that they came from a deal between West Germany and the USSR at that point, so that these kind of this extractivist project in this sort of, you know, in the sort of settler colonial landscape of Siberia is piping oil and gas towards West Germany. And of course this leads to, you know, a kind of something that very much happened in the 90s and 2000s and 2010s, which is a very close link between sort of Russian and German big business, you know, exemplified in figures like Gerhard Schroeder, which very much kind of happens via that kind of oil and gas infrastructure. So there's this kind of link between, you know, sort of German power within Europe and settler colonialism in Siberia, and fossil capital as the conduit between these.
Yeah. So of course, this is something I could go on for a very long time, especially if
we got 5 minutes.
Nord Stream. Yeah, I mean, okay, I'm not even gonna start talking about Nord Stream, right? Because this is such a. But you rightly pointed to these figures such as Schroeder. It could also involve Merkel and other people who are implicated in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, who had kind of turned the German economy into one of the largest sponsors of Russian war in Ukraine. And that's a big topic. Okay, maybe not today. But one thing I would really like to comment on in this entanglement, of that you rightly pointed between the capitalist economies and at the time the so-called socialist economy of the Soviet Union, that at the height of the Cold War, we could imagine that basically they were kind of opposed to each other, but in fact, the industrial so-called development of Siberia during the Soviet era had been paid by the Western Germans, not the Eastern Germans, the Western Germans. And this kind of links back very much back to the era of the so-called exploration of those lands that we mentioned in passing before. Links back to basically the arrival of white people, arrival of white settlers to these lands in the 17th and 18th century. So one thing that's really kind of not really well known, and something I really was surprised to discover, and I think that should be really kind of discovered, is that the Russian presence in Siberia and the presence of white people, basically, the arrival of white people in Siberia was very much a European settler project. It was carried out technically by the Russian state, but the so-called explorers, the engineers, and basically the perpetrators of this first very violent encounters were Western Europeans hired by the Russian Tsars to go to Siberia and to basically subjugate Siberia to the Russian Empire. They were Germans. I mean, Vitus Bering was Danish, the person who gave his kind of name to the Bering Strait and so on. So all of these explorers and conquerors were basically parts of that same European colonial project to which the Russian government was, it seems, merely a proxy. And I know maybe that's helpful in reconceptualization of what's happening in Russia as basically this kind of a botched branch of European capitalist development.
Yeah, I mean,
and
there's
not some kind of obscure Eurasian other.
I mean, we have about 2 minutes, unfortunately, and I would happily talk about this for another hour. But the film ends with a list of the republics of the Russian Federation that declared their sovereignty in 1990 and 91. And, you know, one example of this is reasonably well known outside the region, which is Chechnya, which led to a very, very long-running and extremely bloody colonial war. But the others, much, much less known, that they had all basically made declarations of sovereignty at that point. And in some places, particularly if they had enough sort of money and political clout, like Tatarstan, managed to carve out some autonomy in the years afterwards. But mostly these were all quite quickly subsumed back into the kind of Russian fold. So I suppose the last question, I'm sort of curious as to why you ended with that particular point of, like, you know, that these countries had all basically sort of de facto declared independence.
Yeah, I could give a very long answer, but I'll give a short answer. So the short answer is all colonial empires founded by white settlers, they do collapse sooner or later. Yeah, like the British Empire did it sooner. The so-called Russian Federation will suffer the same fate. This is inevitable. We know this from history. So this list, I think, is just, you know, a small reminder that soon you will be hearing about places like the Republic of Sakha, for example, known under its colonial name of Yakutia, and so on and so forth. And their plight, their struggle, and their de facto declared independence, their sovereignty that has been declared during the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that has been illegally rolled back by the Russian Federation in the 90s in this sort of anti-constitutional coup. This just has to be made a matter of public knowledge. And as a last point, I would like to just inform you that this film, Where Russia Ends, is going to have its UK premiere at the Sheffield Dog Fest next month. I think in around a month. Yeah, not far from Manchester, Sheffield Dog Fest. So if anyone's interested in the trajectories and the ways of the demise of the white settler empire that is known under as a misnomer of the Russian Federation, you are more than welcome to see the film.
Thank you, and I recommend that and all of Oleksiy's films really to the online audience that will exist, but also to the, I think, almost in double figures now, audience that are here now. So thank you, Oleksiy, and thank you.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you, everyone.